Hello. We are continuing to read Echo by Pam Munoz Ryan. We are starting at chapter 14 in part 1 of the book. So let's take a deep breath in and exhale. And let's begin. Chapter 14. No, said Frederick. Every evening for the past 2 weeks, he sat at one end of the kitchen table and sorted through stacks of music for a piece he might perform for his audition. Father usually did the same, but tonight he sat across from him, writing yet another letter to Elizabeth. Frederick tapped the top of the stack. How about this one? Haydn, the Concerto No. 2. Father looked up, nodding. It's complex enough. Put it with the others we're considering. And remember what I always tell you, and all my students. Whichever music you choose, you must perform in such a way that the audience has no choice but to listen with its heart. Frederick set it on a short stack and pushed back from the table. He needed a break. The harmonica from his pocket. He pulled the harmonica from his pocket and played Brahms' lullaby. When he finished, his father gazed at him, shaking his head with admiration. That is exactly what I mean, son. That was radiant. I felt it. Father put a hand on his heart. Here. And that harmonica, such a remarkable tone. It's as if you are playing 3 instruments at once. Frederick puzzled. It's true, I hear it as well. Every song I play sounds as if it is in harmony with something inside of me. Father nodded. Some instruments have a quality that cannot be explained. Maybe you found the Stradivarius of harmonicas. Frederick studied it. If only it was as revered as the Stradivarius violins. Too bad I can't audition with it. Father chuckled. With the current sentiment about the harmonica, I can only imagine the upheaval that would cause at the conservatory. Father folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and addressed it. He held it out to Frederick. Would you drop this at the post office for me on your way to work tomorrow? Frederick took the envelope and set it aside. She's been gone for a month now. Why do you continue to write her every week when you've heard nothing in return? Isn't it clear she has made her choice? Father put his pen down. I know you're angry with her, but I'm her father. I continue because I love her. I want her to remember the sound of my voice. Frederick nodded toward the envelope. Did you tell her that our own dentist has closed his doors because of yet another law prohibiting Jews to practice medicine? Did you ask her if she attends the bonfires in Berlin where they burn books that don't glorify Hitler's ideals? Or about all the Germans who are fleeing the country because they are opponents of Hitler? Father nodded. No. Father looked at him soberly. Be careful, Frederick. Your voice has an edge to it. I fear you are beginning to sound far too much like me. And no, as a matter of course, I never mention politics to Elizabeth. I write to her about the two of you and some of my fondest memories of your childhoods. I tell her how proud I am of her nursing accomplishments. I tell her what we had for dinner. Don't you see, I am not giving up hope that she might someday be my daughter and your sister again, just as I would never, ever give up on you. There's so little I can do for her now, except to let her know I am here and to let her be, you might consider doing the same. Frederick frowned and crossed his arms on his chest. I know it is hard for you to understand right now, said Father, but someday, if I am not around, or your Uncle Gunter isn't around, you might need her. You might need each other. What was Father talking about? I won't need her, Father, unless her feelings have changed. Son, there might come a time. Father, stop! He swept the letter from the table and flew it to the floor. Frederick stood and stormed from the room, calling over his shoulder. You and Uncle Gunter aren't going anywhere. Chapter 15. When Frederick came home from work the following Thursday evening, the furniture in the parlor had been moved toward the walls, and 4 kitchen chairs and music stands were positioned in a half circle in the center of the room. The small table was set with tea, shortbread, and a bowl of anise lozenges. Father, what's all this? Father clapped his hands together. Something fortuitous has happened, Frederick. I called a few friends to see if they'd join me to play some impromptu chamber music tonight, and they have agreed. He nodded to the table. I bought a few things to make everything nice. I have a violinist and a violist coming. I can be the other violinist, unpracticed as I am. Would you indulge me and play cello, if only for tonight? Frederick took off his knit cap, wool scarf, and coat. I don't know, Father, he hesitated. It's Rudolph and Joseph. You've met them both, so you need not feel uncomfortable. Rudolph's daughter had taken cello lessons from Father, so he'd been to the house many times, and Joseph was one of Father's oldest friends. They'd played in Berlin Philharmonic together. Now he was a music professor at the university in Stuttgart. Whenever he visited, Joseph always took a special interest in Frederick, listening to him perform and giving him advice on how to improve. There are good reasons for you to play with us, not the least of which is to make a favorable impression. A favorable impression? Father was beaming. I've discovered that Rudolph sits on the director's board at the conservatory, so you see it's advantageous that you two become better acquainted, and Joseph attended the conservatory, so he's quite familiar with the auditions. I've asked him to look through our music selections and make recommendations about what you might play for the jury. Frederick put his hands on his hips and raised his eyebrows. Please tell me that you're not trying to manipulate. Father raised his hands for him to stop. I assure you, Frederick, it was a lucky coincidence. I didn't find out until after I spoke to Rudolph to come that he was affiliated with the conservatory. And the only reason I called Joseph in the first place was because I know he needs this. He has lost his job, Father muttered. Hitler's new law for the restoration of professional civil service. The what? Frederick asked. It forbids Jews from working as teachers or professors. He's Jewish and a professor. And brilliant, the best viola player I've ever known. When I called him, he told me that a few weeks ago, in the middle of the night, he packed up his wife and children and sent them away to relatives because he could no longer pay his rent. He has stayed behind to care for his father, who is not well enough to travel. I encouraged him to come and play tonight because music is the best medicine for the soul. Father, that was kind of you. I'd love for you to start the evening by playing that harmonica, the same piece you played for me last week, Brahms. I think our guest will be delighted by your prowess and its unusual sound. Father's eyes twinkled. Frederick hadn't seen him so animated since the day before Elizabeth had come home. How could he refuse him? Frederick nodded. Now quickly, into the kitchen with you, and eat your dinner, and then go upstairs to change. They'll be here soon, and don't forget the harmonica. Frederick patted his chest pocket. He wouldn't forget it. Maybe Father was right. Tonight would bring good luck. Chapter 16. Frederick had just come downstairs when there was a knock at the door. Rudolph, tall and lumbering, entered, taunting his violin. A few moments later, Joseph arrived, carrying the viola. He pulled black framed glasses from his pocket and put them on. After the brief introductions, the two men were soon unpacking their instruments and rosining their bows. Before we talk about the repertoire, said Father, Frederick has agreed to play something for you at my bidding. Frederick smiled self-consciously. He turned his birthmark away from the men and pulled the harmonica out of his pocket. He blew a few chords. His pulse raced. How could he feel so nervous in his own parlor? He closed his eyes and began the Brahms. Swept away and soothed by the familiar voice of the harmonica, he repeated the refrain. When he finished, he turned to face the men. If he impressed anyone, he hoped it would be Rudolph, since he'd be judging him soon. But it was Joseph who said, "That was lovely." It did not sound so much like a harmonica as it did a clarinet, and at times a piccolo. It has a unique sound, said Father, looking at Rudolph, who pursed his lips. Did you not like the piece? Martin, it's a toy, not an instrument, said Rudolph. And it's not authorized by the government. It's considered vulgar. Frederick saw Father bristle. Yes. Well, Father frowned. Frederick cleared his throat and quickly said, We should talk about the repertoire. Rudolph spoke up. I suggest Beethoven or Bruckner, possibly Bach. They are sanctioned by the Nazi Party. Frederick caught Father's startled look. Rudolph was a Hitlerite, and Father hadn't known. Did Rudolph know that Joseph was Jewish? Joseph shifted in his chair, looking uncomfortable. I have no problem playing any of those composers. It's settled then, said Joseph. Said Rudolph. He nodded to Joseph, his eyes searching his face. We've met before, haven't we? You used to play in orchestras with Martin. Or am I mistaken? Joseph laid his viola in his lap. You are correct. Are you still with the Berlin Philharmonic? No. I've been some years teaching music at the university in Stuttgart, said Joseph, until recently. A sliver of recognition crossed Rudolph's face. Your family is from Trossingen, then. Your father and uncle have a tailor shop. Cohen Brothers. Isn't that right? But it was closed due to current tensions and sentiments. That's right, said Joseph. Rudolph turned to Father. I cannot play with a Jew. Father stood and held out his hands, pleading. Rudolph, can't we put such feelings aside for the sake of our art, since we are performing for ourselves in my parlor? Joseph is a musician, the best viola player I know. You are a musician. We all have that in common. Rudolph stood and pointed his bow at Father, his voice sharp. For heaven's sake, Martin, my brother is the new regional commandant for the Nazi police, don't you understand? I cannot risk being thought a sympathizer. I cannot even be in the same house with a Jew. If anyone thought I was colluding, His eyes darted toward the window. My brother's son, my own nephew Anselm, works at the factory with Frederick. If Frederick were to mention to him that I was here. Frederick winced. Anselm was the son of the commandant for the Nazi police. No wonder he acted as he did. Sir, I will never mention it. Rudolph put his violin and bow back in the case. Jewish sympathizers are not taken lightly by the Nazis, Father blurted. You and I have discussed politics many times. You've never been a supporter of the new regime. Surely you do not endorse the outrageous laws. We must play the music Hitler wishes. We must read only what Hitler approves. We must look as Hitler wants us to look. Frederick wanted to scream at Father. Had he forgotten he was no longer allowed to be a free thinker? Had he forgotten his promise to keep his opinions to himself? Had he forgotten that Frederick should make a favorable impression? Things have changed, said Rudolph, snapping his case shut. I abide by the new laws, for Germany's sake and for the future of my family. He waved his hand toward Frederick. Have you looked at your own son, Martin? Maybe the new laws are for good reason. Frederick's face stung as if he'd been smacked. Was this what people now thought when they saw his birthmark? Thank goodness for the new laws. I should leave, said Joseph, standing. No, said Father, and then more softly, you are my guest. Rudolph gathered his coat. You've chosen sides, Martin. I hope you understand that I am obligated to discuss this with my brother. He shook his head. I'm disappointed in you, as will my brother be. What were you thinking? He left, slamming the front door behind him. Father slumped in his chair, muttering, I was thinking we would make music. He looked from Joseph to Frederick. I had no idea that things would deteriorate so. I suppose that everyone would get along. We're all just musicians. Joseph put a hand on his father's shoulder. You are naive, my friend. To speak on my behalf, it won't be looked upon favorably, and there's nothing I can do to help. It is I who should be helping you, said Father. Joseph began to pack up his viola. I need to leave, too. You know how people talk. One piece of advice to you, Frederick. When you audition for the conservatory, avoid the Jewish composers. Play Wagner. Hitler loves Wagner. And so his followers must love Wagner, too. And no matter the politics, Wagner is a worthy composer. Goodbye, my friends. He grabbed his coat and hurried out. Frederick turned to Father. What will happen now? Father took a deep breath. I'll be questioned, to be sure. After that, I don't know. I should have kept quiet. His body caved inward, and he looked very small. Rudolph and I have been friends for over 20 years. I taught his daughter the cello. We've gone to concerts together. Frederick, nothing makes sense anymore. Neighbors reporting neighbors, friends reporting friends, everyone afraid. What horror is next? Frederick helped Father to the sofa. He walked to the table, poured a cup of tea, and carried it to him. Stay right here, Father. I'm going for Uncle Gunter. Chapter 17. Uncle Gunter paced the room as Frederick and Father recounted all that had happened earlier that evening. Afterward, he pulled one of his kitchen chairs directly in front of the sofa where Father and Frederick sat. He looked from one to the other. Do you understand what must be done? Father nodded. We must leave. Leave Trossingen? Asked Frederick. But we'll be back as soon as all this is sorted out, right? In time for my audition in January. Father's face crumbled. I am so sorry. Uncle Gunter shook his head, his eyes solemn. I don't think you understand, Frederick. We must not only leave Trossingen, we must leave Germany. Son, if there was any other way to guarantee our safety. They will be watching all of us now, said Uncle Gunter. Frederick slumped back against the sofa. Leave Germany? Leave the only home he'd ever known? Father's and Uncle's voices spun around him. Must be soon, tomorrow. Frederick and I will go to work as usual. Go to the bank and take out money, but not enough to arouse suspicion. Luggage packed and ready. Must have a pretense to see Elizabeth in Berlin. Meet at Gunter's. Walk by night and sleep in fields by day. South. Berne. Switzerland. Frederick shifted his eyes from father to Uncle Gunter. Was it real? Was this happening? He left them in the parlor and slowly walked upstairs to his room, their quiet murmurings a constant hum as they continued to make plans. Frederick sat on the edge of his bed, despondent. All his hopes and dreams, and the world he knew to be safe were gone. How could his life have changed so quickly? He reached out and touched the cello that sat propped next to the bed. They would take the instruments to Uncle Gunter's apartment tomorrow night. He had a storage room that could be locked for safekeeping. But how long would they languish there? Months? Years? Forever? He reached in his pockets for the harmonica. He began to play the familiar Jesu, joy of man's desiring, the final choral in Bach's cantata, number 147. And he was immediately transported to when he first heard it. He was a kindergartner, walking with his father into the music store to buy a bow rosin. A gramophone sat in the center of the store in a carved wooden case as high as a podium. A recording of the choral movement was playing. Frederick was mesmerized. When it finished, he begged the store owner to begin it again, and he obliged. That night, Frederick stood in front of father with a hair comb and a baton, and he hummed the music as if reciting it like a story, note for note. It was his first memory of conducting, and he could still see the surprise and delight in father's and Elizabeth's faces as they clapped for him. He lay down on his pillow and stared into the darkness. Was there a conservatory in Berne? Or anything as wonderful as his life in Trossingen, with his father and Uncle Gunter and his factory family? From the hall below, he heard the tiny door click open on the clock, the steadfast bird sliding forward and cuckooing the hour. But instead of its usual cheerful twitter, it sounded like a warning. Chapter 18. The next morning, on the way to work, Frederick was shadowed by worry and exhaustion. He'd hardly slept. When he had, it was fitful. He was almost at the factory when he heard Anselm's voice. Frederick, wait! He couldn't be bothered with Anselm today. He kept walking, pretending not to hear. He felt someone grab his arm and spin him around. I asked you to wait for me. At first, Anselm looked angry, but his face broke into a smile. I promised to take you to a Hitler Youth meeting, remember? There's one tonight. It's time you saw what fun it is. I'll pick you up at your house at 7 o'clock. Why couldn't Anselm just leave him alone? Frederick pulled at his arm. I've told you, I'm not interested. He tried to keep his voice steady. He hunched forward and walked faster toward the factory door. Anselm kept up with him. It doesn't matter if you're interested, Frederick. You will be after you attend a meeting. You see, your sister made my sister promise that I'd get you to a meeting for your own good and for the good of your family. And I mean to live up to the request. It's not too late for your father, Frederick. It is too late for your father, Frederick, but not for you. Frederick stopped, his body tensed and his hands clenched. That's right, Frederick. Late last night, my uncle told my father all about Martin Schmidt and his Jew friend. From what I hear, things aren't going to go well for your father. He put his hand on Frederick's shoulder and squeezed. But there is still hope for you. Tonight, then, for your salvation and for Germany. Frederick stepped away from Anselm's grasp. I can't. Tonight, I have plans. What plans, Frederick? What is more important? I won't be home. Where will you be then? Tell me. Why was Anselm badgering him? He wanted to yell at him to mind his own concerns, but Frederick wouldn't give up. He blurted out, We're visiting my sister in Berlin this weekend. A family matter. Anselm tilted his head, staring at him. Is that so? Then, as if something had dawned on him, he nodded and broke into a grin. He turned and jogged away, calling over his shoulder, Whatever you say, Frederick. Why had Anselm suddenly backed off? And why was he jogging toward town instead of the factory? When Frederick arrived home from work, the luggage and cellos sat packed and waiting by the door. Had father remembered everything? He and his father ate dinner quietly and slowly. It was too early to leave for Gunter's. After, father washed the dishes and handed them to Frederick, who dried and stacked each piece, his hands going through the motions, but his mind elsewhere. A rude knocking startled him. Frederick locked eyes with father. Are you expecting anyone? Father shook his head. He walked to the parlor and peered through the curtains. It's the authorities. Frederick, listen to me. Say nothing, no matter what their accusations. Father? Frederick felt a sinking in his stomach. Father turned and grabbed him, hugging him. I'm sorry, Frederick. I was the one who brought this upon us. No matter what happens, do not say a word. Father released him and opened the door. 2 stormtroopers in brown shirts stared at them. One was short and stout, and the other at least a foot taller than his companion. Mr. Schmidt, said the tall one, I'm Captain Eiffel, and this, he nodded at his companion, is Captain Faber. May we come in? Before father could answer, they stepped into the hallway. Eiffel nodded to the bags that father had packed. You are going on a trip? Yes, to Berlin to see my daughter. 2 soldiers walked in the parlor and looked around. Father swallowed, with Frederick close at his side. No one said, You see, Mr. Schmidt, that is a problem, said Faber. We received word that you are heading to Berlin to see your daughter. The problem is that your daughter is not in Berlin. She's with the commandant's daughter, preparing for a rally in Munich, and she will be there all weekend. We have other family to visit, said father. They will be in Munich at the rally as well, said Eiffel. Going to Berlin is a charade, isn't it? Frederick felt lightheaded as he put the pieces together. That's why Anselm had stopped harassing him so suddenly this morning. He'd known about the rally in Munich and that Elizabeth would be there with Marguerite. He'd caught Frederick in a lie and told his father, the commandant. Now father had been caught in a lie too. I'm afraid you will have to postpone your travels, since you have no official reason to go to Berlin, said Faber. And we need you to accompany us to the regional headquarters for questioning, said Eiffel. For what purpose? Said Father. That will be explained. Will you join us? Faber said, and swept an arm toward the door. Of course. Father turned to Frederick. I'm sure this will not take long. Eiffel walked to Frederick, stopping a few inches from Frederick's face. Frederick backed away. This boy, he is deformed. Is he also affected? Eiffel spoke as if Frederick weren't standing close enough to smell his breath. He is not deformed or affected. He is brilliant, said Father. It is only a birthmark. It is ugly and offensive, said Eiffel. Does he have someone to look after him? Yes, said Father. Me. I'll be back in a few hours. Isn't that correct? The two men exchanged a glance. Father raised an eyebrow. Does he have someone other than you who might look after him if this takes more than a few hours? Otherwise, there is a place we can send him. You've heard of the home for unfortunates. The asylum? Frederick reached for his father as he had when he was a small boy. That won't be necessary. Father took Frederick's hand and looked at him. Don't worry, son. I am sure this is a misunderstanding. In the meantime, please go to Uncle Gunter's. Faber turned to Frederick. Your uncle, does he share your father's politics? Family members usually do. Is he by chance a Jew lover, too? We'll need his name. Wide-eyed Frederick looked from the guard to his father, who gave him the subtlest shake of his head. No matter. We'll find out from your father. Leave the boy and let's get on with this, said Eiffel. Father squeezed Frederick's hand and then let go. Faber stood at attention and announced, based on Article 1 of the Decree of the Reich, President for the Protection of People and State of 28 February 1933, you are taken into protective custody in the interest of public security and order, on suspicion of activities dangerous to the state. The stormtroopers flanked Father and escorted him out the front door and into a large black car. Frederick waited until it pulled away, then grabbed his coat and ran. Chapter 19. Frederick didn't remember how he arrived at Uncle Gunter's building. By the time he stood in the hallway in the front of the apartment, Frederick's chest ached and he gasped for air. He pounded on the door. When Uncle Gunter opened it, Frederick plunged into the room. The color drained from Uncle Gunter's face. So they have come already. Frederick nodded, trying to catch his breath. Uncle Gunter shut the door, ushering Frederick into the kitchen, where they sat. Tell me exactly what they said. The words swam in Frederick's head, but he tried to repeat them as best as he could. Were they wearing the brown shirts of the stormtroopers or the local police uniform? Brown shirts! Uncle Gunter rubbed his forehead. This is worse than we expected. The local guard is more sympathetic. Father said he would be home in a few hours, said Frederick, standing. I need to get back home and wait for him. Uncle Gunter shook his head. No, Frederick. He will not be back in a few hours, and you can't stay there. They will be back to search. Search for what? Asked Frederick. Information, evidence, anything valuable. If they find books or music that are not approved, they will confiscate and burn them. Frederick put his hands on his head. But this is all my fault. I told Anselm we were leaving to meet Elizabeth in Berlin. How was I to know she wasn't in Berlin? And that she was with the commandant's daughter, Anselm's sister, in Munich? Nephew, none of us could have known. This is not your fault. But right now, we don't have time to debate. We must move quickly and go back and get your things. The familiar and comforting streets of Trossingen suddenly felt dangerous. Were they being watched? Would someone report them? How long until Uncle Gunter might be questioned too? Once inside the house, Frederick quickly gathered the photo of father and mother from his dresser, some sheet music and his cello. He patted his pocket to make sure the harmonica was still there. Uncle Gunter picked up father's cello and grabbed the still waiting luggage. He turned out all the lights and locked the door. As they hurried away, Frederick looked back at his house, now a black cavity between the lamp-lit others. Uncle Gunter urged him to walk faster, even as they struggled with the instruments and luggage. Fear pressed on Frederick's chest. What would happen if the Nazis saw them? Would they be mistaken for Jews who hadn't paid their rent? Was this what it was like for Joseph's family when they were forced to leave their home? Would he and father ever return to theirs? Later, as Frederick lay on the cot, Uncle Gunter had set up for him in front of the hearth. He looked around the small two-room apartment, now crowded with his father's bags and the cellos. He clutched the harmonicas to his chest, cried into his pillow. He could have sworn he heard music, the Brahms. First a child's lullaby, then a mournful lament, and finally a staccato march, accompanied by the ominous sound of jackboots. Was it his imagination or a premonition?